Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today, and thank you for the invitation to talk. It's really great to be here, and congratulations to everyone for all their superb research and all the awards. What I want to talk today to you about is high performance and high-performance teams and a high-performance economy, and I want to start by talking about the reasons that I think it matters, because I think that one should always start with the why. So I'd like you to sit back in your chair, sit back, take a deep breath, relax, and shut your eyes. Just shut your eyes, everyone. Everyone shut your eyes. And I want you to imagine you're 100 years in the future. You're 100 years in the future out in space. It's dark out there. And you look down and there is a beautiful blue jewel of a planet floating apparently beneath you from your space station. You can see all of it. There's a lovely blue region, which is an ocean of solar panels in what many years before was known as the Sahara Desert. You can see where the cities are, but it's hard to see the cities because there's lots of trees and greenery in every city now, and there's lots of blue from solar panels which proliferate in all the cities. You can see that there's clean air everywhere, and you can see that jungle regions have been allowed to regrow. In fact, in 100 years' time, you're seeing a very beautiful world. Now, if you open your eyes a minute, probably that's not the world you've been hearing so much about recently, but that is the world that we as a species, we as a group of people want to build. It really matters because we all want to live in a free and fair society. It matters because we want this planet to be wonderful and not otherwise. We want clean air to breathe. We want our children and grandchildren to have a clean planet. We want greener energy. We want to be sure that this planet is habitable, and wonderfully so, for humans and for animals and other species in 100 years' time. We want to have healthy lives. We want to be defended from threats, and we want to live with dignity. It's one of the defining characteristics of being human. We want to communicate with an enormous number of people, yet maintain and control our privacy. So how do we do all of these things? Well, in short, what we want is to have things we don't have, and that's called a rising standard of living. And we want to achieve it in a sustainable way. And right now, we achieve our rising standards of living in extraordinarily unsustainable ways. So we need to change what we do. We need to do more with fewer resources. We also need to create a lot of new things, a lot of new technologies, a lot of new ways of behaving as societies. Innovations that will enhance our lives. So I want to ask the question, really, what creates a rising standard of living, and how are we doing as a nation? Well, productivity and standards of living. Paul Krugman put it this way. He said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And I just want a little clarification here, because sometimes people think productivity just means cost cutting, which it absolutely doesn't. Productivity means doing more, creating more, okay? One of the first things of productivity, things like Kanban, is preventing waste. Preventing waste. It's one of the first things that efficient companies learn to do, lean manufacturing, yet we live in a world of profligate waste. And as a species, as a nation, we have to become far better at thinking about productivity, actually. So the US is, each worker produces almost 40% more in the US than here. Okay? France and Germany, and Belgium is even higher than those, I just didn't put it down, is around roughly 30% higher than the UK. So how does the UK expect to have comparable living standards and raise its standards if we are so far behind other nations of a technologically similar level? And roughly speaking, half the increase in productivity that occur are due to two related factors. Okay? The first really is the development of innovations. And MITI, the Japanese ministry that looks at such things, said that in the last century, America was responsible for approximately 30% of the innovations, and Britain slightly over 50% of the innovations that have really changed the world. We're very good at developing innovations. But the second part is uptake of innovations. And when it comes to the uptake of research and innovations, the UK has a long-standing lacune, I would argue, that we absolutely have to address as a nation. About half the productivity gap between the US and the USA is almost certainly due to management practices. I think John Van Reenen of the LSE, and if anyone's interested, read his papers on management as a technology. I think he's made a very strong case for that. And what is management? In a nutshell, monitoring, target setting, using that to give you feedback, and incentives, and effective people management. And effective people management means getting great people and developing them and providing them with the tools they need to do a fantastic job when they're doing whatever job they're doing. So we need to get an awful lot better at that as well. And if we want to have a rising standard of living and do the many things we like to talk about the NHS and healthcare. It's very important. Well, if we want that, if we want defence, we want pensions being paid, carbon taxes, we want electric vehicles, we want more efficient use of energy and so on and so forth, we need to become far more innovative and far more effective at driving innovation into the economy. And one of the great problems is that UK productivity growth flatlined around 2008, and it's been really subpar for a long time since. I just want to give one example. There are many I could have thought of, but this one chart says a lot. China's not on this chart, but this is the number of multi-purpose industrial robots per 10,000 employees. At the far left, you see the Republic of Korea, South Korea, then Japan, then Germany, and on the far right, you see the United Kingdom just behind the Czech Republic and Australia. Okay, we are not particularly great at uptake of technologies. So how might the UK become productive, more productive? Well, there are many, many, many answers to that, and I want to talk about some of them from the perspective of something that I think we do really well. And there are two things, many things we do really well, but the two I want to talk about are the Olympics and how we used these ideas to really revolutionize our ability to win medals in the Olympics, and also in Formula One, because I think Formula One are really tremendously good. What they do is they manage change, they leverage R&D very effectively. It's easy to do R&D. Leveraging your R&D, using your R&D is what we want to talk about here. Combining marginal gains and innovative leaps, both of these groups are tremendously good at doing that. And harnessing the productive power of competition. A lot of groups don't like competition. They find it frightening and bad. But actually, if you know how to harness the power of competition, it's a great way to become better. One of John Van Reenen's interesting analyses is that in the UK, the most effective companies are typically those that are engaged in competing in export markets and competing around the world. Competition is very good at sharpening the sword. So, key lessons from the Olympics. The first key lesson from the Olympics is focus on excellence, and that sounds really simple. Many people would say, well, of course we do that, but actually many people don't. Many countries, by the way, in their Olympic programs don't. They have a pot of money, and the decision is to spread it across everyone, across every sport. The good, the bad, just give everyone money and let everyone get on with it. And there was a decision made with a limited resource in the Olympics to award toward success. It's interesting that in science, a very similar thing happens, and that's one of the reasons, not the only, but one of the reasons the UK science base is so world-leading. We give more money if you win gold medals. We give a little less for silver and less for bronze, and so on and so forth. That decision was actually not an easy one to take. Many people challenged it. I'd say it was the decisive decision that was made. Disruption and marginal gains. So disruption says, how do you make a really big gain? And marginal gains is, I think, become very famous. It was something that was thought about already in the mid-90s, but only really started getting deployed in about 2003. And it says this: continually find ways to improve. I'd say that the Japanese industry, famously the Toyota method, is an exemplar of that, and a lot of operations research people very well aware of that. We saw that one of the awards was for the theory of constraints. That's a tremendously good tool for finding your bottleneck, removing it, and carrying on, continually improving, for example. The law of productivity, typically you find there are, for athletes, for example, but different things, there may be different numbers, but something like 5 things that you have to do. Talent aside, you have to, for example, you have to train efficiently. You have to have the right nutrition. You have to have the right recovery. You have to change your training. You have to have good sleep. There's a number of things you have to do. And here's the rule. The result you get is the product of those. So if you are 80% good at each of those things, you'll be about 30% in your overall performance relative to what you could achieve. And if you push that up to 90%, on each of 5 things, you'll only be at about 60% of where you should be. You actually have to be 100% on everything. And if you have one weak link, you'll be nowhere. Okay? That's really key. A lot of people, if they're achieving 80% in life, say, well, I'm pretty good. I'm 80% at 5 things, and I need 5 things, so I'm 80% good. They're nowhere near that. So the real key in the Olympics is understanding that. If there are 5 or 6 or 7 key things you need, you have to be pushing to be as close to 100% on all of them as you can. And when you understand that, you understand why we do what we do. Because there is no one secret to the way we won all of the gold medals we won. There are 1,000 things, all of which we have worked very hard to become good at, to add up. And of the core things, we try to hit 100% for every athlete. Very key thing, for example, psychology. We want 100% from every athlete on their psychology. I've really learned the invaluable role of performance directors. Coaches we tend to think of as people running around in tracksuits, but actually they're essential. An athlete nowadays probably isn't going to medal without at least one excellent coach, and probably a team of coaches and a performance director. And you will never see someone like Roger Federer, for example. He's going to have a coach. Even though he's played tennis pretty well for a long time, he doesn't say, gee, I know how to play tennis, I will dispense of my coach. No, he gets a better coach. He will get the best coach he can, as will any tennis player, because any athlete knows the value of coaching and a performance director. And I'm amazed how sometimes that entire piece of thinking is missing from many of the things we do in the UK economy. We just do stuff without having someone whose role it is to see how well we're doing it and help people to do it better. Leveraging R&D and competition, what I'm largely going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the value of leveraging effective R&D a little. In Formula One, what we really are interested in is modeling, simulating. Anyone who likes OR would find Formula One to be a playground of joy, because what we do is we model 95% of what happens in Formula One is modeling. We build digital models of everything. The car is a digital model, and eventually we make an actual physical car as close to the digital model as we can, and that's what you see on the TV screen. And everything you can think of is simulated well before the race and during the race, okay? Modern Formula One cars are extraordinarily complex, at hundreds of levels of complexity in terms of engine settings, in terms of the amount of fuel use in a lap, the engine regeneration, and on, and everything is optimized. They achieve incredible turnaround times. They build a completely new car every few weeks. That's marginal gains. That is so effective that every single car manufacturer will, by the end of the season, have a car that's about 2 seconds faster than it was at the beginning of the car, which in Formula One terms is huge. That shows the power of focusing on every single day. How do we get better? How do we do something we haven't done before? We have an idea. Let's be creative about our engineering. Let's try something. Okay, they are not static. And then there is a group in-house that will be working on next season's car, and that is a totally new design. If you follow Formula One, you'll know that the new cars really are very different, and that's that's where you try to get your disruptive change advantage. I think one of the things that's very interesting about Formula One is extreme quality pushing to the limit. These cars are pushed to the engineering limit. If you've got 1 gram of metal that you could do without, you throw it in the bin. They're absolutely at the limit, and yet they're incredibly reliable. Testing was banned in Formula One. It's the only sport I can think of where you're not allowed to actually practice it. Formula One drivers are not allowed to drive the cars outside of competition. okay? What happened when they banned testing is that the cars got way more reliable. And they got more reliable because they said, let's test the components, make sure they all work, and let's model everything really carefully. And one thing that's not talked about enough is this. As you heard, I'm a professor of creativity, and what I see here is enormous creativity. Formula One for me is a boiling place of creativity. People often think creativity is something for the arts. Let me tell you, I personally think that one of the most creative places you can possibly go is anywhere doing Formula One. The engineering creativity is extraordinary. And it is in creativity that we innovate. The power of mathematical modeling is something that I found in my career and many careers to be extremely remarkable. Here is a Bayesian multi-target sonar tracker being tested on some data, finding targets in clutter. And virtually identical Bayesian analysis is what we use in medical AI systems. So one of the great things about the kind of tools that operational research, Bayesian analysis and so on, do and optimization is it gives you a tool set for tackling problems that a priori look quite disparate. So our basic view is model, predict and optimize, measure, and then have feedback. And here is the rule. Feedback's the breakfast of champions. If there's a missing link, everywhere from school upwards, it is this, that we know from lots of studies that feedback is what gives improvement. Measure a thing so you can get feedback, and yet feedback is notoriously poorly done. For example, many firms have this wonderful thing, 360 feedback at the end of the year. At the end of the year, you get told, did you do well or not? The end of the year, if you're an athlete, better be the end of the day, after every competition, right? A lot of modern extant notions of what good feedback looks like are really, truly poor, okay? And improve those, you improve performance. No one would dream of giving feedback to an athlete in a 360 at the end of the year as their primary source of feedback. Not if they want to win, they wouldn't. And one more thing, which is I wanted to talk about, is the power of simplicity. We live in a world in which a lot of times people want to improve things. They make them more complicated. Anyone live in London, seen what happens with traffic? You all know what I'm talking about. But the power of simplicity is a thing that was understood by Leonardo. His use of light and tone and shade was extraordinarily complex by the standards, not only of his time, but today. And yet he understood the power of simplicity and made everything look clean and simple. The Blackbird was the most amazing aircraft at a time when you could only fly a jet aircraft on full afterburners for a few minutes before the engine would essentially melt. And you might get to about 1,500 miles an hour if you did it. This flew at 80,000 feet at about 2,100 miles an hour on full afterburners for hour after hour after hour. What they did was utterly extraordinary to make it, and yet Kelly Johnson, who's in charge of that, said, keep it simple, stupid. Why? Because you want to keep complicated things simple. The power of simplicity. And if you want to have a modern example of that, think of your iPhone. Think of the stack of hardware and software, the complexity of everything that they have done to bring this to you, yet you can buy one, switch it on, and you don't need an instruction manual to find your way around. It is simplicity, mastering complexity. And that is a thing I think we have to get much better at. So I want to talk a little bit about what we do. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we do and a little bit about the history as I see it, as a rather personalized history of the early days that drove us to being able to really change our performance in the British Olympics in particular. So first thing is use technology to drive improvement. There are lots of firms that use X-ray analysis. You'd be shocked how many groups don't use a simple thing like X-ray analysis. Here you can see at the millimetric level a defect in a ski. Well, do you want to use that one? Probably not. That's what skis look like under X-ray. We can look at the binding holes and see if there's any damage around them and so on and so forth. I want to talk a little bit about flow separations because we're going to talk about actually why you model things and then why you do the real world. This is certainly relevant both to Formula One and to everything else we do. I'm going to show you a couple. There'll be some around spheres and one a simulation over a flat plate. But this is showing the flow that's the most basic flow that causes you to be slow. This is over a flat plate, and you see turbulence, and we'll go back, and you can see around a circular object, your energy is thrown away in those vortices. The limiting factor when you're cycling is essentially air drag. Okay? The limiting factor in Formula One is essentially air drag. And so you're trying to fight that, minimize that all the time. All of the work we do is to minimize that. And here's the thing, it's nonlinear, it's super complicated, and there are lots of interactions. So at some point, even computers don't do a good enough job, and you have to actually have first some mathematics to fine-tune things. And secondly, you really have to have a wind tunnel. So if we look at how that behaves, this is an object with an ellipse, so it's if you like, a simplification of what a leg or an arm or a helmet might be like, and you can see the startup. As you start to move, that's how air behaves, and then you get this asymmetric flow as vortices form a vortex street. And what they're doing, if you're an athlete or even if you're a Formula One car, is they are sucking your energy away and slowing you down. Okay? So one of the things we try to do is change position on the bikes, and we try to do a lot of work to minimize this energy loss into the fluid stream as we're going. One of the things that I worked on, for example, was the effect of textile microstructure. So to explain that, if you just take a sphere or a cylinder, say, and you compute the flow, you find that you get the flow as we saw on the computer, but the computer doesn't really understand how the surface detail affects it, and it turns out to affect it quite a bit. So I did a theory here. You can see on the top left what an actual fiber might look like. On the bottom left, you can see the calculation where blue and red is energy being extracted from and injected back into the flows. So sometimes you need that, and sometimes you need to model various things. So wakes are very turbulent, and one of the things that will occur is that if you're behind a turbulent wake, which happens if you're going around a track, you're going to start with a clean wake, with a clean air, and then hit some turbulence. That will affect your performance. And Paralympics present another set of challenges because of the complexity of body positions and equipment. So I think we can see the wake here. Yeah. So that's a wake calculation coming from a supercomputer showing us some of what can happen in principle around some of these objects. We'll do some parametric optimization. So what's a good way to sit? We do that in the computer. And we do some wind tunnel work. This is for some other objects. So we really do apply, model, simulate, actually measure, and of course, then we have the issue of going out and measuring with athletes. So from time to time, I'll go off to Norway, or for example, and see what the athletes are doing and actually measure things in various places with the ski team, for example. So what I want to talk now is how do we get, where do we get to, and how does a change of approach, how did it actually pan out? And how did it all start? I think most of you probably know that we did pretty well in some of the Olympics, but how did that all start? So here we are, history of Olympic medals. In 1996, we were 36th in the world. We got 1 gold. The last Olympics, as you can see, we were 2nd in the world, which I think for a nation our size is an incredible achievement. Really, I do. I hat off to everyone who's involved in that. But you can see the progression from 36th. We had a big jump, held that, and then 4th, 3rd, 2nd. So something was happening. And Beijing, you can see, we had a really big leap in medals. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my view on how a lot of that happened. If we look at cycling, this is over a number of years, and you'll see that the sports, when I was a kid, everyone's talking about athletics, sailing, fabulous. Ben Ainsley and the folks, brilliant sailors. We have some tremendous rowing success. But what you see here is a colossal leap. So where you see that the blue line, which is the cycling, was 0 medals. Then we get 1. I'll talk about that. Then we get 2. Wiggins and Hoy. And then suddenly we go to 8. We get 8 and 8. So what was that about? And in fact, this chart doesn't show something which is even more dramatic. when we have the one medal on where it's marked number 4, that one medal, Jason Quealy got the medal, that we had 0 medals in Paralympics. By the time we get to Beijing, they won 17 gold medals, okay. The Paralympic athletes are absolutely fabulous, and so this absolutely crossed not only from the Olympics but to the Paralympics. So you can see that cycling went from essentially nowhere really to 42% of our medals, and has been a huge producer of medals ever since. So I'm going to give you a little brief view of cycling. This is Chris Boardman's bike from the back, and if you look at it carefully, this is a beautiful piece of engineering. Actually, this bike was made by a Formula One company. Very, very few places that you could get high-quality carbon fiber work at the time. Formula One company did this, and if you look carefully, you'll see it only has forks on one side. And if you're an engineer, you'll know that gives you an absolutely colossal torque on the bearings. And to make a bike that only has its blade on one side of the wheel is truly challenging, but that's what they did. Long bit part of laminar flow there. So this is an extraordinarily low drag bike. Yep, I really do like bikes, and there's Chris Boardman on his bike. Take a look at his position. We'll talk a little bit more about that position now, but see the way his back curves and how his hips are set. Have a look at that. And here's my view, my take at least on all of this. He was actually, Chris was a tremendous amateur time trialist. But amateur was absolutely the word. He was not one of the professional Tour de France cyclists. He was an amateur. He was a carpenter from the Wirral. And we were told as a nation, you have no chance of winning a gold medal. Brits don't know how to train, they don't know how to cycle, you haven't won a gold medal for 72 years, okay? It may be hard for some folk now to believe that it was considered impossible for us to win a gold medal, and it was a joke for us to discuss it, but that is where we came from. Mike Burrows is a bike designer who designed the bike you've just seen, and Peter Keane was doing a PhD, he's finished a PhD in exercise physiology and training, and he was looking for a superb athlete to work with. Boardman was looking for someone who could bring up his level, and they got together. And here's the first interesting observation. People thought Peter Keane's training, which was very different to the standard training, had to lose. His ideas had to be wrong. It's not the way we do it. And this is one of the very first things I've learned about how not to do things in life, is to jump in and say, well, we've always done it this way, so your new idea has to be bad. Okay, I hear that plenty, and that is a great way not to make progress. So Peter Keane revolutionized things. He became head of performance of UK Sport and performance director, you'll note, for the 2012 Olympics. It is no surprise to me that we won so many medals with Peter in charge of it, and it's not random that they put him in charge of it. So here you can see Chris sitting on the bike, and I want you to look at his leg position. He's trying to get his back as low as he can to reduce drag, but he can't get his hips. What you need is your hips to be wrapped around to get power from your legs. In that position, you get low drag but no power, and modern cyclists have to actually be able to bend their lower spine around like a pretzel. It's actually extraordinary how they can do it. And so Chris had to learn to train. He was our top time trialist, and he had to learn how to sit on a bike. Because the F1 wind tunnel guy said, pretty much famously said, well, you better learn how to do it because you've lowered your drag 30% or some such. That's the evolution. If you see now how a top cyclist sits on the bike, you'll see curve, a lot of power being driven into it. And as Tony Purnell said, well, I guess the cycling performance goes to show that physics works. And yeah, physics and an awful lot of training and an awful lot of optimization going together, but yeah. So Chris won. In fact, he never actually finished the race, technically, because the race ends two ways. You can cross the line and they split time you, or you can catch up the person in front and overtake them. He was so fast, he overtook the world champion with a lap to go. And for those of us who remember watching this, that was an incredible moment. Remember how few gold medals we had? Everyone in the country was watching this at some weird hour, I seem to remember, of the day. It was a huge achievement by Chris Boardman, and it really changed everything that came after, because that got attention. That got attention because we had taken a sport that was considered a no-hoper and got a gold medal. Then Chris Field of Hotter is a brilliant designer, designed an Olympic bike for Graham O'Brien. I think it's probably the fastest bike anyone's ever built, personally. The specs now are different, so you won't see it raced. Unfortunately, Graham got a viral illness and never really performed in that Olympics. And Chris then didn't really get a proper budget, so he built in his garage. It's a pretty well-equipped garage, but in his garage, he built the bike used by Jason Quealy, and Jason won a gold. And winning that gold meant that under the new rules, we got a micro budget to do something in R&D and for training for the cycling. So David Brailsford and Chris Boardman were sitting around post-Atlanta, and they came up with their concept of marginal gains. But it wasn't until 2003 that Sir David Brailsford said, look, Chris, come in, join the Olympics, and deliver these gains. We've talked about them, we both believe in it, we haven't got it. 2003, Boardman did that. He had 1 year before an Olympic cycle, so really hard to get the gains in. So the real delivery was the 2008, and that's why we got all those medals, because of Chris Boardman coming in. And Chris is meticulous and superb human being. In my opinion, Chris not only won medals because he was a superb athlete, but because he has such a fine mind. He is a remarkable human being. Peter Keane had a lot to do with building up the approach that he and Boardman had worked on, and then the Secret Squirrels were formed, and so Dimitris Katsanis designed a new faster bike. It's a real cycling icon, if you ever know the black bike that we used on almost all our Olympics. And Rob Lewis, OB, who's been kind enough to lend me that some of the computational simulations you've seen, did a lot of the computational work. I think it's summarized really by Aristotle. You know, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. That is true, but there's a caveat. So is mediocrity. And to go from one to the other, you have to change habits, and that can be challenging. So I want to talk about, that was a little about the history of how we got where we got. Chris Boardman, I think the most important thing Chris said really was, he said for him it hadn't been about the winning. He just hadn't thought about winning for a very long time, certainly not until the year of the Olympics. What drove him was to keep finding ways to get better. And so after every race, after every time he'd get out on the bike, he'd analyze data, and we became a data-driven and feedback-driven athletics body and nation, and that's what really changed everything. So fit and healthy, athletes should be fit, right? Healthy, right? Well, that gets challenging when you push your body to the limit. Paula Radcliffe had lots of stress fractures and problems. Jessica Ennis had to miss the Beijing Olympics. Many people thought she'd get a gold. I was asked to do some work with an athlete that had a tendency to get stress fracture. It was actually a horse. Horses get stress fractures, and so we came up with the idea of measuring them with accelerometers, and this has now spread to a lot of other sports. Rugby players use them and so on. Winter sports present even bigger challenges, quite literally. The jumps are twice as high as a diving board, okay? You're doing tricks while 20 meters in the air, quite a lot of them upside down while rotating. And there's big pointy things you can hit, including lumps of steel and things you can drop right off. If you look at the side of some of those jumps, you'll see that if you miss it, it's a long way down the side, okay? And that does happen. This is Katie Ormerod. She was our best hope for a gold medal, possibly in the last Olympics, and she fell off one of those slides, fractured a wrist, carried on, and then fractured her heel. I think finally she had to have 6 operations. She's now back up on the slopes, and I'm rooting for Katie to get a gold in the next Olympics. But how do you deal with that? Unfortunately, people can get concussed. So one of the things that we do in research is try to do everything we can to keep athletes fit and healthy. So we have a baseline establishment of brain activity for athletes. This is not an athlete, it's an example, e.g. But you can see here that if you look, you'd see this red and say, well, that's something that maybe shouldn't be there because normally is more green. So we'll establish baselines, and if anyone has any head injuries, we'll be able to map the QEG. we're looking to do, haven't yet done this, but I'm looking to do tensor diffusion imaging to work out whether there are any shears on the white matter tracks that we can detect if anyone has impact. And of course, we're also doing research for things like new helmets to make sure that we can actually reduce concussion risk. And if any of this works, or as it works, we will share it with any other groups that want it, because our view is we don't want to win because other athletes of other nations get injured. If we can help them not get injured, we will. We want young people or athletes of any age to be fit and healthy, and we'll beat them on our own fair terms. So what about the Winter Olympics? Talking of the Winter Olympics, well, Torvill and Dean, we'll all remember Torvill and Dean, but we hadn't won a gold medal at all since Torvill and Dean. And then Alex Coomber, who was amazing. Alex was doing skeleton bob, which is roughly get a tea tray, have some little bits of metal on it, hurl yourself head down at about 80 miles an hour down a twisty ice thing. She would practice by having a sort of tea tray thing with little wheels on and hurl herself in the local Sainsbury, I think it was car park, but certainly local supermarket cars park, hurl herself and slide. And that's her practice route. And she got a bronze, so big achievement. Shelley Rudman got a silver, and then that kicked up a little bit of funding, and I really mean little, it wasn't very big, for us to do some R&D. And so with that, and that's why I say leverage effective R&D, focus on what matters. We used our methodology, model it, simulate it, design it, test it, get feedback. What happened? I'll tell you in a moment, but this is an example of a rig. We got some friction testing rigs at the UCL in the ice lab who were very helpful to us, so we could actually find out what happens when you're on ice or in snow, because we didn't know. We don't have any runs in this country. And what happened there was we just applied the same methodology we'd applied to cycling, exactly the same approach. It's the approach that matters. It's not the technology that matters. It's the approach that matters. You could take the same approach and apply it to a business. You could take the same approach and apply it to a kid doing schoolwork. The approach is, how do I get better? That's the approach. How do I optimize anything I can optimize? How do I become efficient? That's the approach. We went from people saying, well, the Brits will never win in a Winter Olympics because, hey-ho, you know, they're not really a Winter Olympic nation. 3 gold medals in a row. We are, the ladies team are absolutely 100% the team to beat. Okay? So, what's it all about? Well, if we want to keep this beautiful, and I believe we all do, we have to do more with less. We have to learn to do more with less. We have to model and optimize everything that we want to work well. We can't have cities that don't work well in the future with traffic jams and energy being wasted. We can't. Excellence is a product, not a sum, and so people and companies need to be much better at teaching this. We need to teach this in school. We need to teach this at school. Many kids just don't know this simple thing. Innovation drives progress, and innovation comes in jumps, but what is so often ignored are marginal gains. As I say, I think the Japanese have really shown the world how to do that in business. I think the British have shown how to do that in sport. Outstanding management practice drives outstanding results, and I'm sorry to say, but as a nation, we are not where we should be. And so I think we should really do better, and I think personally one of the ways to do that is we should have a national Centre for Productivity, a place that people can go to, hub and spoke model around the country. People go and learn best practice where they can see what better application of things like OR could do for them, and driving that into large chunks of government would also be good. I was pleased to see that some of the awards were given for work in the National Health Service, which is certainly a place that could do with some optimization in some areas. Having absolute clarity of mission combined with focus and feedback. Lots of people and lots of companies do things and they lack absolute clarity, they lack focus, they try to do too many things, and here is the rule. Figure out what you want to do and focus on that. And then make sure you have effective feedback. The weakest link's often feedback. And finally, don't fear competition. Actually, competition and challenge are fabulous if you don't fear them. They can make you much, much better. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for paying attention.